welcome to the Unseen Shelf. Today, we will explore the final volume of his trilogy, The Third Reich at War. This book is chronicling the dramatic and catastrophic years of 1939 to 1945. In this book, Evans presents a detailed and harrowing account of how Nazi Germany plunged the world into total war, escalated its genocidal policies, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own destruction. This volume is not merely a military history. It is an unflinching examination of the war's impact on soldiers and civilians alike, the brutality of Nazi occupation policies, and the ideological fanaticism that drove the Holocaust to its horrifying climax. Evans explores Hitler's relentless expansionist vision, tracing Germany's devastating military campaigns, a calculated extermination of millions, and the internal dissent that, though present, was too weak to alter the course of history. Through meticulous research and vivid narrative, Evans reconstructs the Third Reich's final years with chilling precision, from the swift victories of the early war years to the brutal stalemate on the Eastern Front, the destruction wrought by Allied bombing campaigns, and the desperate last-ditch attempts to salvage a doomed empire. He details the horrors of occupied Europe, the daily terror in the concentration camps, and the psychological unraveling of a regime that refused to surrender even as its fate became inevitable. Ultimately, The Third Reich at War is a powerful study of how ideology, war, and totalitarianism led to an unprecedented scale of human suffering. Evans provides a compelling, comprehensive, and often disturbing account of the war that reshaped the world and left an indelible mark on history. Let's begin.
Part 1. The Path to Global War. Chapter 1. The War Begins. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, Germany launched its long-planned invasion of Poland, unleashing the full force of its blitzkrieg, lightning war strategy. Combining rapid tank movements, mechanized infantry, and devastating aerial bombardments by the Luftwaffe, German forces swiftly overwhelmed Polish defenses. Within days, Warsaw was under siege, and by September 27th, the city surrendered. Polish forces fought valiantly, but were no match for Germany's superior firepower and tactical coordination. Despite their treaty obligations, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, yet took little immediate military action, leading to what became known as the Phony War, a period of uneasy standoff in Western Europe. Hitler, expecting quick capitulation from the Western Allies, saw their hesitation as further evidence of their weakness. He believed that Britain and France lacked the resolve to truly challenge Germany's expansionist ambitions. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east on September 17th, as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin to divide Poland. With Poland crushed between two military superpowers, resistance collapsed. By early October, Poland had been erased from the map, partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Chapter 2. The Fall of Europe. With Poland subdued, Hitler turned his attention westward, determined to eliminate British and French opposition before they could mount an effective resistance. In April 1940, Germany launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway, swiftly securing both nations. Norway was particularly strategic, as it provided control over North Sea naval routes and valuable access to Swedish iron ore, essential for Germany's war production. In May 1940, Hitler unleashed his long-awaited Western offensive, striking Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The blitzkrieg strategy once again proved devastating. German panzer divisions bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by cutting through the Ardennes forest, an area French commanders had believed was impassable for large armored forces. The rapid German advance stunned the Allies, forcing them into chaotic retreats. By late May, British and French forces were trapped at Dunkirk, their backs to the English Channel. In a desperate and heroic effort, the Dunkirk evacuation, Operation Dynamo, managed to rescue over 300,000 Allied troops, ferrying them back to Britain. Although the evacuation was a logistical success, it underscored the scale of the Allied defeat. France was now fully exposed. On June 14, 1940, German forces entered Paris, and just days later, on June 22nd, France formally surrendered. Hitler dictated the surrender terms in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its humiliating World War I armistice in 1918, a calculated act of symbolic revenge. France was divided. The North fell under direct German occupation, while the collaborationist Vichy regime was established in the South. Despite Hitler's triumph, Britain refused to negotiate peace. Under the leadership of Winston Churchill, Britain vowed to fight on, leading Hitler to order Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. However, before any land invasion could occur, the Luftwaffe needed to gain air superiority. This led to the Battle of Britain, July-October 1940, where British RAF pilots, aided by radar technology and superior tactics, successfully defended Britain's skies against relentless German air raids. The Luftwaffe's failure to break British resistance forced Hitler to abandon his invasion plans. By the end of 1940, Germany controlled much of Western Europe, but Britain remained defiant, marking the first significant check on Hitler's expansion. The stage was now set for a wider, more destructive conflict, as Hitler turned his attention eastward, planning his most audacious move yet, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Chapter 3. Hitler's Expansionist War. By mid-1940, with Western Europe subdued, Hitler turned his ambitions toward further expansion, convinced that Germany's military superiority would guarantee success. His vision for Lebensraum, or living space, meant a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, but before launching this colossal campaign, Hitler sought to secure Germany's southern and eastern flanks. Evans describes how Hitler's strategy became increasingly bold, exploiting diplomatic weaknesses and military superiority to expand German control without provoking immediate resistance from the major Allied powers. To prepare for future campaigns, Hitler moved to solidify alliances and secure resource-rich regions. The Axis Pact with Italy and Japan strengthened Germany's geopolitical position, while economic agreements with the Soviet Union provided Germany with vital raw materials. Yet, Hitler viewed the non-aggression pact with Stalin as a temporary convenience rather than a lasting peace agreement. One of Hitler's most significant moves during this period was the invasion of the Balkans in early 1941. Although Mussolini's failed invasion of Greece in late 1940 had embarrassed the Axis, Germany swiftly rectified the situation. In April 1941, German forces overran Yugoslavia and Greece, ensuring complete control over southeastern Europe. This operation delayed Hitler's plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, but in his mind, it was a necessary step to prevent British interference in the region. At the same time, Germany's relationship with the Soviet Union grew increasingly strained. Despite the economic benefits of their pact, Hitler had always intended to break it, believing that Germany's true destiny lay in conquering the vast lands of the Soviet Union. Convinced of Soviet military weakness and eager to destroy Bolshevism, Hitler ordered preparations for what would become the largest invasion in history. Evans paints a vivid picture of this critical phase, showing how Hitler's reckless confidence and ideological fanaticism shaped his decision-making. By early 1941, Germany had consolidated its hold on much of Europe, and Hitler was ready for his most ambitious and destructive campaign yet, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Part 2. The War of Racial Annihilation. Chapter 4. The Invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. More than 3 million German troops, accompanied by Axis allies, stormed across the Soviet border, seeking to crush the Red Army in a matter of weeks. Blitzkrieg tactics, so effective in Western Europe, initially overwhelmed Soviet defenses. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, while German panzer divisions raced deep into Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Evans describes the sheer brutality of the campaign. Soviet cities fell one by one, Minsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv, all at an astonishing pace. Yet, despite these early victories, the German advance soon slowed. The Soviet Union's vast geography, coupled with fierce resistance and logistical difficulties, posed unforeseen challenges. Hitler underestimated the Soviet will to fight, and Stalin's ability to mobilize his vast resources. As autumn set in, the Germans found themselves ill-equipped for the harsh Russian winter. Their advance toward Moscow stalled, and counterattacks from the Red Army pushed them back. The invasion that was meant to be a swift victory had turned into a grinding war of attrition. Evans highlights the significance of this turning point. Operation Barbarossa shattered the illusion of German invincibility and set the stage for the prolonged, bloody conflict that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Chapter 5. The Holocaust begins. While the German army pushed eastward, a different war was being waged in the occupied territories, one of racial extermination. Evans details how the invasion of the Soviet Union marked the beginning of the Holocaust in its most brutal phase. Following behind the advancing Wehrmacht were the Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads tasked with the systematic execution of Jews, communists, and other so-called enemies of the Reich. Entire communities were rounded up, forced to dig their own graves, and shot en masse. These mass killings, Evans explains, were not spontaneous acts of violence, but a deliberate, premeditated escalation of Nazi racial policy. By late 1941, the Nazis sought more efficient methods of extermination. The infamous Wannsee Conference in January 1942 formalized the final solution, planning the industrialized mass murder of Europe's Jews. Death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were expanded or built to carry out the Nazis' genocidal ambitions. Evans details how ordinary Germans, bureaucrats, railway workers, and soldiers became complicit in genocide, illustrating how the Holocaust was a vast, organized operation, not just the work of a few extremists. The war in the East was not only a military conquest, but also an ideological war aimed at annihilating entire populations. By the end of 1942, millions had already perished, and the machinery of genocide was operating at full capacity. Evans paints a chilling picture of this dark chapter, showing how Nazi ideology, military aggression, and racial hatred converged to create one of the most horrific crimes in human history. Chapter 6. War and Genocide in the East. As the Eastern Front descended into brutal warfare, Nazi occupation policies in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe became increasingly violent. Evans details how Hitler's war against the Soviet Union was not merely a military campaign, but an ideological and racial crusade. The Nazis viewed Slavic populations as inferior and sought to reshape the East through mass extermination, forced labor, and the complete destruction of Soviet cities and infrastructure. In occupied territories, civilians faced unimaginable horrors. Villages were razed, and millions of Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved or worked to death in brutal conditions. The Nazis implemented hunger plans, redirecting food supplies to German troops while allowing local populations to perish. Entire communities were depopulated through mass executions, deportations, and forced labor schemes. The Jewish population, already targeted by Einsatzgruppen death squads, faced escalating persecution. By mid-1942, ghettos in cities like Warsaw, Lviv, and Minsk were being systematically emptied, their inhabitants sent to newly expanded death camps such as Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. The Holocaust was now in full force, with gas chambers becoming the primary tool of extermination. Evans highlights the sheer scale of suffering, emphasizing that while Jewish populations bore the brunt of the genocide, millions of non-Jewish civilians, Poles, Roma, and Soviet citizens were also slaughtered in Hitler's racial war. The Eastern Front became a vast killing field, where the lines between military strategy and genocidal policy blurred into one horrific reality. Part 3. The Global War and Nazi Decline. Chapter 7. The Tide Turns. By late 1942, Hitler's dream of a swift conquest in the East had collapsed. The Battle of Stalingrad became the defining moment of the war's turning point. Evans vividly describes the desperation of German troops as Soviet forces encircled and trapped the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, cutting off supplies and forcing them into starvation and eventual surrender. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the German Sixth Army surrendered, marking the first major defeat for the Wehrmacht and a catastrophic blow to Nazi morale. Meanwhile, the Red Army, now reinforced and well-supplied, launched a series of counter-offensives. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw the largest tank battle in history, with Soviet forces successfully repelling Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The once dominant German war machine was now on the defensive, forced to retreat westward as the Red Army began liberating occupied territories. On the Western Front, the Allied invasion of North Africa in late 1942, Operation Torch, pushed Axis forces out of Africa, setting the stage for an invasion of southern Europe. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily, leading to the downfall of Mussolini and forcing Germany to defend Italy. Hitler, unwilling to concede any ground, diverted critical resources to Italy, weakening Germany's ability to recover on the Eastern Front. Evans captures the strategic failures of Hitler's leadership, his refusal to retreat, his micromanagement of military decisions, and his insistence on fighting to the last man, all contributed to Germany's accelerating decline. By the end of 1943, the initiative had fully shifted to the Allies. The Third Reich was no longer an unstoppable force, but a regime desperately clinging to power as defeat loomed ever closer. Part 4. The Fall of the Third Reich. Chapter 8. D-Day and the Collapse of Nazi Europe. By mid-1944, the once invincible Third Reich was crumbling on all fronts. Evans describes how Hitler's refusal to retreat, his overextension of resources, and the combined strength of the Allies led to an unavoidable reckoning. Nowhere was this more evident than on the Western Front, where the Allies were preparing for their most ambitious operation yet, D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, facing fierce German resistance. The battle was brutal, with high casualties, but by the end of the day, the Allies had established a foothold. This marked the beginning of the end for Nazi control in Western Europe. As Evans details, Hitler refused to allow strategic withdrawals, insisting on holding every inch of ground despite dwindling manpower and resources. The German military, once so feared, was now stretched thin, fighting desperate battles on multiple fronts. In August 1944, the Allies liberated Paris, and soon after, they were pushing toward the German border. Meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east, liberating Poland and reaching the outskirts of Germany. By late 1944, Germany faced a two-front war with no realistic chance of victory. Yet, Hitler remained convinced that a single counteroffensive could change the war's course. Chapter 9. The Nazi war machine crumbles. As the Allies closed in, Hitler launched one last desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944 to January 1945. Evans paints a gripping picture of this final German offensive, where Nazi forces launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. For weeks, brutal winter combat ensued, with American and British troops holding their ground despite being caught off guard. While initially successful, the German advance soon stalled due to lack of fuel, stiff resistance, and the overwhelming power of Allied reinforcements. The failure of the Battle of the Bulge drained Germany's remaining military reserves, sealing the fate of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army launched a massive offensive in January 1945, smashing through German defenses and reaching the Oder River, just miles from Berlin. The German military was now in full retreat, and Hitler, isolated in his bunker, refused to accept reality. His orders became increasingly erratic, with generals too afraid to contradict him. The Nazi war machine, once feared, was now in total collapse. By March 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine, and German cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing campaigns. Civilians fled westward in panic, desperate to escape the advancing Soviets, as the war descended into chaos. Evans details the sheer destruction of Germany's final months, cities reduced to rubble, refugees flooding the countryside, and an entire nation bracing for inevitable defeat. With Berlin now surrounded and Nazi leadership in disarray, the final act of the Third Reich was at hand. Hitler's empire, built on conquest and destruction, was now facing total annihilation. Chapter 10. The End of the Third Reich. By April 1945, Germany was in its final collapse. The Red Army had encircled Berlin, the Western Allies had pushed deep into Germany, and Hitler's once mighty war machine was in ruins. Evans vividly describes the chaos within the Nazi leadership as defeat became inevitable. Hitler, now physically frail and mentally unstable, retreated into his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing delusional orders to armies that no longer existed. As Soviet troops stormed through Berlin's devastated streets, Nazi officials scrambled to escape or secure their own legacies. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels remained by Hitler's side, while Heinrich Himmler, sensing disaster, attempted secret negotiations with the Allies. The remaining German troops, many of them teenagers or elderly men from the hastily formed Volkssturm, fought desperately but had no hope of victory. Inside the bunker, Hitler refused to surrender, clinging to the fantasy that some last-minute reversal could still save Germany. On April 30th, 1945, realizing that all was lost, he committed suicide alongside Eva Braun, his longtime companion and newlywed wife. Shortly afterward, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their children before taking their own lives. With Hitler dead, Admiral Karl Dönitz briefly assumed leadership, but his authority was meaningless. The German government collapsed as Allied forces closed in from all sides. On May 2nd, Berlin officially fell to the Soviets. Hitler's grand vision of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12 years and ended in utter devastation. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, and the following day, May 8th, became known as Victory in Europe 5E Day. Evans captures the sheer devastation of Germany's defeat. Cities reduced to rubble, millions of civilians displaced, and the horror of the Holocaust fully exposed to the world. The war was over, but the consequences of Nazi rule would shape global politics, justice, and historical memory for generations to come. Conclusion: the legacy of the Third Reich. As the war ended, the world was left grappling with the scale of devastation wrought by Nazi rule. Over 50 million people lay dead, including 6 million Jews systematically murdered in the Holocaust. Cities across Europe were reduced to rubble, economies shattered, and millions of civilians displaced, their lives irreversibly changed by years of conflict and genocide. Germany itself lay in ruins, divided into East and West under Allied occupation, marking the beginning of the Cold War. The once mighty Reich was now a defeated, occupied land, with its people struggling to reconcile the horrors of the past with the reality of their shattered future. The Nazi ideology, which had promised a 1,000-year empire, had instead left behind a broken nation, drowning in guilt and destruction. Evans examines the Nuremberg trials, where top Nazi leaders were held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet, many perpetrators escaped justice, blending back into post-war societies or finding refuge abroad. While the trials established a precedent for international justice, they could never fully atone for the immense suffering inflicted by the Third Reich. The world vowed never again. Yet Evans warns that the dangers of authoritarianism, radical nationalism, and racial hatred remain ever present. He argues that the lessons of Nazi Germany are not confined to the past, but serve as a cautionary tale for the modern world, reminding us of what can happen when power is left unchecked and ideology turns into mass murder. Finalizing the Third Reich at war. Ultimately, the Third Reich at war is not just a history of a war. It is a profound examination of how ideology, war, and totalitarianism led to destruction on an unprecedented scale. Evans forces readers to confront the uncomfortable truths about human nature, power, and the fragility of democracy, ensuring that the shadows of the past continue to serve as warnings for the future. Thank you for your time and thoughtful engagement. If you have any reflections, insights, or topics you'd like to explore further, we'd love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you again for our next book discussion. If you enjoyed this content, your support through a subscription and a like is truly appreciated. See you soon with the next book. Thank you,